Shalom and welcome. We're gathered together today to explore the many issues that are relevant to the creation of the Jewish state. And it does not begin our path to independence simply with one leader or another, or one historical event to another, but rather a string of events that carry us from 3,000 years of history to the modern day. We're gathered together to launch our Forum 75 program, where we have the incredible opportunity to honor 75 years of Jewish independence, sovereignty in our ancestral homeland. The international recognition that had been given throughout the decades prior to the establishment of Israel in 1948 are crucial to understanding not only the processes that took place, but also the decisions and the decision makers who made that process possible. I'm honored to welcome today two tremendous experts in the arena of diplomatic affairs for the sake of the Jewish nation. One is a leader of the Jewish people in the diaspora, whose experience as a Zionist leader himself began from a young age as a teenage boy, meeting with leaders from whom he could learn. Richard Heidemann, my own father, I am indebted to him and my mother, with the great Zionism with which I was raised, had the tremendous opportunity to serve as the international president of B'nai B'rith Youth Organization. And at that time, he met other great leaders, amongst them a tremendous man, Avigdor Warshaw. Avigdor Warshaw was at the time president of B'nai B'rith Israel. And upon meeting with my father, they established a relationship that carried on throughout even the lives of myself and my children. And so therefore, alongside Richard Heidemann today, we also welcome Gadi Warshaw, the son of Avigdor, who is a political science expert and a historian, who's going to walk us through that very first decade of the 75 years of international recognition that had led up to some very tremendous historical events that many of us know nothing about. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And Mr. Heidemann, wonderful to have you as a part of our show again.
How nice to be welcomed by my daughter here in Jerusalem.
Well, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to come together because, in truth, we've got three generations who are all empowered in some way by the history we have learned about what it took for us to live the life we have today as Jews, with a proud Jewish state that is in our ancestral homeland, and it's something that we want no one to be able to take for granted. But we live in a world where everyone is lying about our history, distorting the truth, exaggerating mistruths, and yet here we are, constantly struggling to tell the truth. And so having you here today as an expert in political science and the history of those first years before the state was established, it's really a fundamental opportunity for us to look back at history and decide what can we learn from it? How could we even take lessons from the past in order to apply to current and future decisions for the state of Israel and for Jewish life around the world? So thank you so much again for joining us today. As we dive into our first decade, what do you see as one of the very first steps towards the beginning of the recognition? And we're counting that 75th first recognition as November 29th, the partition plan that is voted on in the United Nations as our first big vote, our big legal recognition. But do you see that as the first step?
It's a milestone, and it's an important step. But Kaftet b'November, as we say in Hebrew, the 29th of November, it's a peak, but it started before. We have to go a few years before that. We have to go to the Shoah. We have to go to the Holocaust, the end of the war. And then there is empathy. There is sympathy to the Jewish people, to the refugees. Not only that, there are interests. There is the Cold War. There are things that other nations want to achieve in that area, and the Jewish people, and in the future the Jewish state, as a role in that plan. So we are starting in 45, going 46, 47, and then there is a decision in the UN for the partition plan. There is a surprisingly very, very strong supporter of Israel, which is the Soviet Union. Not because they like Zionism. They didn't become Zionists overnight. They have interests. The interests are changes of powers in the world. After the Second World War, there are two powers, new powers, that are standing up. One is Soviet Union, one is United States. The old powers are stepping down. Britain, France, and Britain, who is controlling the Eretz Israel, controlling the land of Israel, stepping down, getting weaker, giving away territory, and the British mandate is almost over. And there is a vote in the UN. The Soviet Union wants to take over. They see what's going on in Israel as an opportunity to get into the area. If I can take, say, the Soviets saying to themselves, if I can take the place of Britain, very, very good. If I can oppose United States, maybe even better. So they support Israel. The Americans, the bureaucracy, the administration are against the partition plan. Every plan that at the end of it, at the end of the road, would be a Jewish state, for them, for the administration, is something that is against the interests of the United States. And in that crucial moment, on that dramatic moment, a dramatic decision, President Truman took a personal decision to support the partition plan against the advice of all of his people around him, surroundings, and he said, I must, morally, I must vote in favor of the partition plan, and this is started a new stage that we'll see in a minute, the relationship between the Zionist movement and the United States.
Because it's interesting to think that what does a leader have to do in order to reach that decision? I mean, inevitably, and you know, Dad, the importance of that Jewish voice of leadership as it's dominant in each of the phases of Jewish life in America. And at that time, it was really an upheaval. People were emotionally charged, shall we say, by being incapacitated from doing anything during the Holocaust. And that's for the people who knew even what was happening. So you have those who are making movement, and you have those who are unaware, shall we say, naive to some of these realities. Who are the leaders, and what kind of influence are they having to make Truman make the decision that he's about to make?
Well, as Gadi mentioned, President Truman took a personal decision. I'm a big believer that presidents and prime ministers don't only make their decisions based upon national security interests, based upon foreign policy interests, but they oftentimes base their decisions upon considerations that are personal to them. So let's take a look at the relationship of President Truman to the American Jewish community. You're in a period after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. You're in a period after the camps have been liberated. You're in a period after General Eisenhower, who later became president, participated in the liberation of camps, ordered that the cameramen come in and document the atrocities for history, all of which has been delivered to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. President Truman turned to people and was open to people who he could trust. You mentioned B'nai B'rith International. I can tell you, and I believe Gadi, as a doctorate in history and political science, will verify, one of the key organizations that played a role was indeed B'nai B'rith International. It was the first non-governmental organization admitted with status at the United Nations in its formation when they gathered in San Francisco after the end of the war. And Frank Goldman was then the president of B'nai B'rith International. He picked up the telephone and he called a B'nai B'rith leader in the same hometown in the Midwest from which President Truman came. That person was Eddie Jacobson. And Eddie Jacobson took upon himself to communicate with the president as to how important it was to stand together with the Jewish people in the context of history, but also in the context of national security, and also in the context of the Jewish people having the right to the reestablishment of their homeland in Eretz Yisrael. That, by the way, was something that didn't just come about with President Truman, because you previously referenced the fact, Gadi previously referenced, the power of Great Britain, which was high and was diminishing, but which changed following World War II. But few concentrate on World War I. As a result of World War I, there was the creation of the League of Nations. The United States had a major role in the League of Nations. Other countries, of course, did. And the League of Nations took the spoils of war from World War I and created mandates, one of which was the British Mandate, which included all of the area in which we sit today. That British mandatory period governed all the way up until including the date of the partition plan and leading to what I trust we'll be talking about next, and that is the pursuant to the partition plan, the declaration of the State of Israel. One more comment I think it's worth noting. Let's explain what is the partition plan. Let's explain what was the partition resolution. I want to defer to Gadi, but I'll just say it briefly this way. The United Nations gets formed. There is a Security Council, each of the countries having a veto, and there's a General Assembly of one nation, one vote. The partition resolution was introduced at the United Nations, and that partition resolution then had to be voted upon. What was the partition resolution? In small terms, it called for the creation of the independent Jewish state. It called for the creation of the independent Arab state. And it called for special status for Jerusalem. In that context, I turn it back to Dr. Warshaw.
Thank you. It was well said. And the fact that the Soviet Union and the United States supported at the end the partition plan brought other countries to vote yes. But then, after the vote, there was some kind of a second thought in the United States. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. There's not going to be a strong Jewish state. We made a mistake. Let's retreat. Let's go back from the partition plan and do some kind of other things here, like trustees or something. And everybody in the administration, and I mean everybody, I mean Pentagon, I mean State Department, I mean the CIA, everybody advises the president, President Truman, it was a mistake. If there's going to be a Jewish state, don't recognize. If we can hold it back and not let the Jews declaring their homeland, it will be better for the United States. In their eyes, the most important thing is interests, the American interests, the global interests. The area is most important to us, the Americans, because of its oil. We need oil for Europe, for the Marshall Plan. We cannot turn our backs to the Arabs. They are the most important place. They are the most important states in the area, not the Jewish state. The Jewish state will lose. If there's going to be a war, no way Israel is going to win. We are going to connect ourselves to the side who is going to lose. And what we have 22 Arab countries. We have one Jewish state. We need the ends, we need the votes in the UN. More than that, we need them in order to fight the Cold War. We need them in order to stop Soviet Union. We can do it with the Arabs. We cannot do it with the Jews. So don't recognize the state of Israel. And again, you mentioned B'nai B'rith. You mentioned Eddie Jacobson. True, exactly true. Chaim Weizmann was the biggest Zionist leader then, wanted to meet Truman. And the president said, no, I'm not going to meet anybody. I don't need that noise. I had enough. They're trying to get an appointment with the president. It's not working. So then, B'nai B'rith, Frank Goldman, called Eddie Jacobson in Kansas and said, listen, the president won't let you down. Meet him. On that meeting, ask him to meet Chaim Weizmann. Eddie Jacobson calls the president, get an appointment. Before he goes into the room, the advisors of the president they tell him, don't mention Israel, don't mention partition plan. You are here as a friend of the president, no politics. He said, of course not. He goes in, and of course he says whatever he wants. At the end of the meeting, Truman says, yes, I'm going to meet Chaim Weizmann. And that was crucial for the American decision to recognize the state of Israel 11 minutes after the declaration on May 14th, 1948, again, as a personal decision of President Truman, because everybody else said, no, it's against the interests of the United States. But he said, I cannot take another decision. Morally, I must do it.
So look at this short period from the end of the war to the partition resolution adoption November 29th, 1947. In history, that's a very short period of time. All the support had to be brought together for adoption of the partition resolution, calling for these two states and international status for Jerusalem. Are you telling us, Gadi, that there was second thoughts in Washington to what would happen after the adoption at the United Nations of the petition resolution?
Absolutely. And also the ambassador to the UN, Austin, I think was his name, on March 48th addressed an idea that the UN will retreat, will go back from the partition plan, and they will go to some kind of trustee, and that the Jewish state won't be established.
So during this time period, November 29, 1947, which really is 75 years ago now that we're celebrating, it's not just celebrating 75 years from the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, which we'll talk about. But during these months, there was all of this consternation and debate as a foreign policy matter, as a national security matter in the United States, different people pulling with different interests. But we lead all the way up to the fact that on May 14th, 1948, Ben-Gurion announces, we've all seen the photos, we've seen what we've seen, we've heard what we've heard, the great radio address, reading the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. That time period from November to May is a very short time period. Yeah. Shortly, we'll all be celebrating 75 years of May 14, 1948. We'll do it on the Hebrew date, Yom HaAtzmaut, the celebration, which this year I think is April 25th. How did it come about that the president, even though his advisors said retreat, how did it come about that President Truman didn't retreat, but instead charged forward?
Well, he met Chaim Weizmann, and Chaim Weizmann told him, after what happened to the Jewish people in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, you cannot turn down the opportunity. There is a window of an opportunity to establish a Jewish state, which is already in war, by the way. Right after Kaftet B'November, November 29th, a civil war started here in Israel between Jews and Arabs. So there is a war going on. And Chaim Weizmann is telling President Truman, you must recognize the state of Israel when it's going to be declared. It's important to us. It's crucial to us. The world is looking at you. Morally, you cannot do anything else. You must recognize the state of Israel.
And did he?
Did he? 11 minutes. 11 minutes after the declaration in Tel Aviv, in Dizengoff House on Rothschild Avenue, 11 minutes after that, United States published a formal recognition of the new state of Israel.
Before Ilana takes us forward, can you comment further, Gadi, on two of the great powers that you referenced earlier? What role did they play from the date of partition resolution to the date of Declaration of Independence? Those two powers being Great Britain, which still was the mandatory power, and the Soviet Union.
Great Britain wanted to go out. They didn't want to stay. They themselves went to the UN and asked the UN to take responsibility for the area because they want to evacuate the area. They want to be out. The empire is stepping down. Soviet Union, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to go into the area. There is no vacuum. If Great Britain is out, we want to be in. And for them, Israel is an opportunity. The socialist movement is very, very active here. The leaders are socialists. So maybe Israel is not going to be communist. Maybe they're going to be neutral. Maybe they're not going to be against us. So let's support the state of Israel. Now, it's not because of love to Zionism. We must emphasize that. There is no love story. Interests. For them, the area is very, very important for the Soviet Union. And Israel can be a bridge for them to step in.
So I'm going to step in with a couple of points that both of you have raised. First of all, we're actually discussing a strategy of diplomatic relationship development in the international legal scene. On the other hand, you're talking about personal relationships. Because Balfour, in his declaration of November 2nd, 1917, would never have made that had Weizmann also not been involved, along with other leaders in the British Jewish community who were very active in sharing a personal approach to how to shift public opinion. More importantly, to how to shift the opinion of public leaders and politicians at that time. And Balfour being the foreign secretary, it was a tremendous, long-standing effort that had begun earlier at the end of World War I, which you mentioned. So we've now born out of the Zionist movement, which becomes solidified following Herzl and the creation of the Zionist Congress. You have movement after movement and initiative that leads up to Balfour making his declaration. And there's the famous story, if you've ever heard, of Chaim Weizmann meets Balfour at a party and somebody says, "Why do you want this piece of land?" And he says, "There's lots of land." And he says, "That's like telling me to go visit another old lady because my grandmother lives too far away. This is our home." There's an emotional and even logical component to the way that Weizmann, whether it's facing Balfour or facing Truman, is demonstrating that this isn't just about a moral obligation you must recognize. Because don't forget, that's what the hater community of today is claiming, that there is a Jewish lobby and Jewish power, and we are pushing our way, whether it is through money or political influence. Well, you've touched on something where it is a moral value that Weizmann emphasizes to Truman. And it's not just because of those killed in the Holocaust, I believe. Weizmann is saying the same thing he had said a decade, 2 decades before the Holocaust. Again, we know Jews have been murdered in every war, so always there is that empathy that could be ignited. But there's something to the longevity of the Zionist story that we tell, the truth that we tell, that is based on an ancient history, and that's the moral founding. Not you have to support this Truman because a bunch of Jews were killed by the Nazis.
There is another point to that. Let me emphasize on that. In the United States, in 47, 48, and even before, after the Holocaust, there are 2 levels of reaction to the Jewish question. One is the administration. They look through the prism of interests, of national security interests. what's good for the United States, what's not good for the United States, how we see it. But there is another level, a level that in years we're going to call the level of special relationship, the level of relationship between the American people and Zionism, the American people and the Jewish people. And in those years, the people, the unions, the person on the street, in a way, they see Israel as themselves. We were pioneers, now you are pioneers. We broke from Britain, now you break from Britain. We share the same values. We talk about democracy. There is democracy here, there's going to be democracy there. There is some kind of good relationship between the American people and the Jewish people, but it will take years, and we're going to get there. It's going to take years before the level of interest or the level of special relationship will become stronger and stronger, and then they will level. Not then. Then it's like that. There is the relationship and there are the interests, or we can do it like that because the interests are heavier.
And it fluctuates almost in each decade with each leadership. Do you think that the attitudes change with every administration? Right after Truman, we see a pretty significant shift in American policy as it relates to Israel. And again, we're living in a time right now where we're watching over the last, almost 2 decades, we're watching that shift happen again. So how do you put that into context?
In 1953, President Eisenhower said, if I was the president in 1948, I won't recognize the state of Israel.
And this is the same Eisenhower who, as you mentioned, insisted on people will try to deny it. And nowadays we have all the photos. They're still trying to deny it. He has empathy then, but suddenly is shifting, and it's because of interest.
Exactly. He's not anti-Israel. He's not against Israel. But he said, because of American interests, that's the way I should act. For us in the area, the most important states are the Arab states, not Israel. That's why we also call the area the cold decade. Till 57, 58, 59, it's a cold decade, or maybe sometimes even freezing, like after the war in 1956. The relationship between America or the United States and Israel, not so good. It's cold.
So there's an interesting element here. Now, you mentioned that he's not anti-Israel and interests are his goal. American interests are his goal. Would you say that there was any anti-Semitic influence in his cabinet that might have also been a voice he was hearing in his ear? Is this also a dynamic that maybe we know of as a challenge that the Jewish community was having to face? That there were some remnants of anti-Jewish sentiment that were growing amongst this very same cold decade. In a sense, almost resentment towards Israel, extracting, whether it be aid or support, for this tiny, shall we say, fledgling state that was never going to succeed. And was there any efforts that were being made to counter what could have been kind of the anti-Israel rhetoric that we see today, but in its early phase? The very existence of the state is newly created. There are people out there who resent it. Maybe they resent it because of traditional hatred of Jews. Maybe they were anti-Semites. And don't forget, we're dealing with also during the Holocaust, a presence of anti-Semitism amongst America. Most people are very naive about. They've become more familiar with recent documentaries that have been made. Many of you may have even seen about America and the Holocaust, and these are other issues, but they don't disappear. They're a part of that context. So you've raised the point of a cold decade. How is it affecting the American Jewish population? Is there some anti-Semitism that he's hearing in his ear? Is there a counter? Is there an effort to stop the negative trend of putting down Israel because they're not a strategic asset?
Okay. Few things I must say regarding that.
Yeah.
First thing is, one thing that we must mention is that although United States recognized the state of Israel 11 minutes after it was declared, immediately America imposed arms embargo on the area, and the only country or the only state that suffered from that embargo was Israel, because the French and Great Britain sold arms to the Arabs. No one sold arms to Israel. So immediately there was an arms embargo imposed by the Americans. Second thing, like in other situations, the State Department was always pro-Arab. The voice that President Truman and then President Eisenhower heard from the State Department was anti-Israel. They saw the Arabs as the main things, the main target. Israel is liability. That's the voice which was coming out of the State Department for years. For years. They focus on the Arabs, they focus on the American interests. They didn't like Israel. The State Department, they didn't like Israel. And when Eisenhower replaced Truman, they said Truman was too much Israeli. He was too much pro-Israel. We should even go back. And remember, Truman was one who decided about the arms embargo. And they say he was too pro-Israeli. We have to step back because we are too friendly with them.
So much of what we're hearing today. Would you like to jump in? We are touching on so many different fascinating points at this time.
I think it's worth noting, coming out of the end of World War II, in 1944, the Arab League was formed. Arab countries coming together long before the Partition Resolution, long before the establishment of the United Nations, and long before the Declaration of Israel. The Arab League convened, and they adopted protocols, and they adopted policies, and they adopted declarations, and they adopted plans. And one of the things they adopted was the Arab League boycott. 1944, the Arab League boycott is launched. And that Arab League boycott remained in existence throughout the entire period that we're talking about. That means leading up to the UN Partition Resolution adoption, leading up to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, throughout the War of Independence that followed, through the 1956 Suez Campaign, the war between Egypt and Israel. But few pay attention to the fact that that Arab League boycott officially is in place today. Let me add a few things. What were some countries that were part of the Arab League? Egypt. When Egypt reached an agreement with Israel later, it broke from the Arab League in order to do so. Jordan. When Jordan reached its agreement with Israel, it broke from the Arab League, still being a member of the Arab League, reaching political negotiations in later decades that would allow Egypt to have peace with Israel, would allow Jordan to have peace with Israel. We've just seen over the last few years the adoption of the Abraham Accords. Some people write it off, or shall we say cloud it, because of different political interests. U.S. government interests, Israeli government interests, which governments were in power, etc. But the Abraham Accords are historic, not just because we've seen since the adoption of the Abraham Accords such a growing relationship with the United Arab Emirates, with Morocco, with Bahrain, with even Sudan. But we've seen trade. Those four countries I just added are members of the Arab League. And yet, today as we sit here, the Arab League boycott officially, that was adopted in 1944, remains in existence. And in fact, just recently, the Biden administration announced additional enforcement actions against the Arab League boycott, saying to all the remaining countries of the Arab League, if you will continue to follow the boycott of Israel, you will face penalties. The Arab League boycott is monitored by the U.S. Department of Commerce. There's an actual office that monitors Arab League boycott activities. And through the U.S. Department of Commerce, there's enforcement. And different countries have actually been named to be violators, and they've been sanctioned. And one of the countries that was the most sanctioned from the time the Arab League Boycott Compliance Office at the Department of Commerce was adopted, I think in 1979, If you monitor which countries, which we've done a study of, which countries were assessed by the U.S. Department of Commerce for violating that Arab League boycott that dates back to 1944, the main country that was hit and hit and hit was the United Arab Emirates. And they were the first one to come to the table during the Abraham Accords to sign. So, as we talk about difficult moments in history, decisions of presidents, decisions and actions of prime ministers, we haven't really talked about the leadership of Ben-Gurion except his reading. And we haven't talked about the war very much, the War of Independence. Gadi made a comment on the embargo, if you will, of arms. So where did Israel get its arms? It's worth talking about. But it's worth talking about in the context of the national security interests of not only the United States, but the other world powers, how they make their decisions. And yet, during these 75 years, Israel has not just simply floated along, it has thrived, it has grown, it has become so multicultural and diverse. You can walk through the streets and you could see people from all religions and all garb and all walks of life gathering together, working together. Forget what the PR is, the anti-PR campaign against Israel. But we have to go back to that 1944 Arab League boycott and remember that if it continues to exist as it does, there is an official policy of each of those governments to be, shall we say, at war with Israel, to not recognize Israel, and to not do any commerce with Israel, to boycott Israel. By the way, we can't overlook the fact that just recently, Lebanon, with Hezbollah, with its government, and the United States and Israel, entered into this, what I'll call a tripartite Lebanon maritime agreement. How it will work, whether it'll be enforced, whether politics will overtake it, I'm not commenting on that. This is not a political discussion. But the fact of the matter is that indeed, in spite of the Arab League boycott, in spite of official government policies, things have happened that have allowed Israel, as the Jewish state envisioned in the Partition Resolution, to come into existence, to grow as the most important democracy in the entire region, the strongest ally of the United States in the entire region, in spite of the challenges Gadi spoke about at the State Department and intelligence interests and defense interests. How did it all change, Gadi?
But if this is the case, what you're saying, that the Arab boycott has been in existence since 44, and the United States is directing their decisions in many ways based on whether or not Israel is a strategic asset, and the strategic asset at this point are the Arab states. Does the United States somehow align themselves at that time with a boycott endeavor of the Jewish state, simultaneous to having discussions of supporting its creation?
Okay.
They're basically making an agreement on the basis of an immoral boycott.
They didn't boycott Israel. There was financial support, not a big one on the first years.
You mean from the United States?
From the United States. They were not boycotting Israel. They allowed Jewish people or persons in America to send money to Israel in order to help. They didn't stop it. And they gave all kinds of benefits to that. The thing is the arms embargo. And during the independence war, Czechoslovakia gave arms to Israel on behalf of the Soviets, because again, the Soviets saw Israel as an opportunity to take a step into the area. Another step that they took, they allowed young Jewish people from Soviet Union to make aliyah to Israel in order to help the IDF in the first days of the war. It stopped like 6 months after the beginning of the war, and in 1950, there was a change in the Israeli political orientation. In the first 2 years, Israel decided not to support not the West, not the East. Israel should be neutral and will try to gain whatever she can from that bloc and from that bloc. 1950, the war in Korea, the Americans said to all of their supporters, if you are with us, you must declare it publicly. Israel had no other choice but to declare in the summer of 1950 that they are with the West. From that moment, there is a decline with the relationship with Soviet Union, and in a few years, the Soviet Union will be the biggest rival of Israel, and they will show the Arabs, listen, we regret of what happened in 1947, 1948. We are with you 100%. Whatever you're going to do, we're going to support you. We are against the state of Israel. And this is a change. But still, regarding the United States, it's still the cold decade. Politically and from a military point of view, there is no arms sales to Israel in that decade, in the 50s. By the way, the first American weapon system that they're going to sell Israel is going to be in 1964. There's going to be an agreement for the Hawk missiles. In 1962, they will bring it to Israel in 1964. We are talking about 16 years after the establishment of the State of Israel. So this is the situation in the 50s. We have no allies besides one, France. France is all of a sudden an ally by default to Israel. We are not with the Soviet Union. We want the Americans, but we don't have them. What we have is France. Now, Israel from the beginning knew that at the end we are with the West. No question about it. Ben-Gurion didn't hesitate. He knew that in the future Israel is going to be part of the Western Bloc, not with the Eastern Bloc. Because of circumstances, we're going to be in the middle. But from 1950, Israel is publicly out there in the Western Bloc. Things will change later on.
What is happening at this time in terms of the street? What's happening in terms of public opinion? Today, you cannot divorce current events and political upheavals from the voices on the street. What's happening at that time, both in the Jewish community and in the way the Jewish community is advocating for Israel and her rights and her need to be defended in public opinion? What's happening at that time?
Many American Jewish organizations were strong voices in support of Israel before the partition plan, before the declaration of the state, and following the declaration of the state. Without naming them all, I can tell you I'll pick one in addition to B'nai B'rith International that I mentioned, the American Jewish Committee. Powerfully focused as a voice to see to it that the message of the American Jewish community is clear. All the different organizations, by the way, were running to the White House and using their own connections. And eventually it got to the point where people in the White House said, we can't keep receiving each of these separate Jewish organizations separately. And it led to the creation of an organization called the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations.
What year?
In the 50s, to actually have a voice of coming together without diminishing the voice of the individual organizations. But the point is that leading up to partition, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there is no question that the Jewish organizations were asking questions. Why didn't we bomb the tracks? How is it that 6 million Jews and millions of others were exterminated in World War II? An attempt to annihilate the entire Jewish people, first of Europe, but then of the entire world. And Jewish organizations were focusing on it. Now, it's not like today with influencers. It's not like today with different social media capabilities. It's not like today with 24-hour cable and other television. The news took a long time for the news to, shall we say, be disseminated. We have to remember where we were back then. But there is no question that even during the war, the Roosevelt administration clearly knew what was going on and made certain decisions based upon what Gotti would call interests as to whether to bomb, whether to not bomb, how to liberate, how to, shall we say, allocate war resources to winning rather than losing, but how to take care of the people that had been put into these not just concentration camps and not just labor camps, but into these death camps, these extermination camps. And the fact that so many of them have actually been preserved, and although there's a lot of criticism by some people of the government of Poland, the fact of the matter is the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum, a state museum, and its foundation, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation, is committed to preserving the truthful history of the Shoah that occurred by the atrocities of the Germans in the camps and the extermination of children and of women and of men and of whole populations, and not just Jewish populations. There became, in the aftermath of the war, a sense that there can never be such atrocities again. So when the United Nations was formed, there was a simultaneous adoption during those years of universal conventions. You talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You talk about the concept of genocide introduced by Raphael Lemkin, a word that didn't exist before of genocide. Today it's bantered about, and I don't mean to diminish, because there have been terrible, terrible atrocities over these last 75, 80 years since the end of the war. We're seeing them even today. The American Jewish community got very much involved, but they were involved before. They perhaps didn't have the ability to communicate, to impact the way it is done today. Why is it done today? And people complain about, shall we say, Jewish power or the Jewish lobby. The fact of the matter is, who will stand up for the fact that there shall indeed never again be permitted to be such a unique atrocity as the Holocaust? Who will stand up? Well, today there are Christians that stand up. There are Muslims that stand up. There are Baha'is that stand up. There are Seventh-day Adventists that stand up. But the loudest voice to stand up must and is indeed that of the Jewish community. So the organized Jewish community has become very much organized. It's a very politicized community, left, right, and center. There are many Jewish organizations with their own focus, their own interests, their own passion, their own commitment to building a better future, tikkun olam, to repairing the world, a Jewish tenet. So with all of that, you did have in the 40s and before and since active Jewish involvement, and it became to be realized that the only real way to impact policy in the future is to see to it that you impact the minds of the policymakers. That means that you interface with them. That means that you meet members of Congress. You meet their staffs. You go to the State Department. You go to the White House, and you go to embassies. In Washington, there's 192 embassies. At the United Nations, hosted in New York, maybe 192 from all different countries, because they all have one vote. They all have missions in New York. And so it began that there was an outreach, one country at a time, for good and proper reason, not for power, not for control, not for lobbying as the Jewish lobby, but to advance interests. And every community has the right and the ability to advance their interests. And shame on us if we don't advance our own.
So it's funny because you bring us back to the idea of interests, that on one hand you have political entities that must address and make their decisions based on the interests of the country that they are representing. You have the Jewish interest, which isn't about a country only, it's also about a people very misunderstood in the spectrum of humanity. We see that with the fluctuation of how Jews are treated in human rights issues. And the Holocaust was a human rights violation of Jews in particular. With all of the other victims of Nazism and World War II, the Holocaust is an incredibly unique example. And it's very important to recognize what's happening in the Jewish voice at that time. Something that is important to note is the Biltmore Conference, which is actually brought together in New York, and it is the very first time ever that Zionist and anti-Zionist Jewish organizations in the United States come together in support of the Zionist dream. Now, the Zionist dream, for most of us, we know that it's a 3,000-year-old dream that perhaps has the chance to be revived time and again throughout history, but the Holocaust is a final and, shall we say, emotional push, because was there really interest involved in 33 states voting yes on November 29? Was there really interest? We've discussed today whether there were moral interests, whether there are financial interests, and how it affects the decade right after it. But at the very core, we have to be able to understand what are all the dynamics at play that allow the decade to pass. Meaning, eventually, there is no more arms embargo. Eventually, yes, the Russians, not only do they side against Israel and side with the Arabs, but we also know that they effectively create what we consider now the Palestinian identity, the idea of a Palestinian entity. This is all invented, shall we say, through this Russian involvement. And we have all of the paper trail in the history that I hope that we'll have an opportunity in the future, of course, to discuss when we relate to that decade of what these 75 years of recognizing in a legal international forum Jewish rights to our ancestral land. And that's what has to bring us all back. Is there a moral value that drives even the decisions of interest? Today, we live in a generation where indigenous rights are essential. They are respected. Indigenous rights should be acted upon. The Jews' indigeneity to this region should be a part of every moral decision, whether or not those financial, political, or social interests are being appeased. But again and again, we find ourselves facing the need for appeasement. So one of the ways I'd like to take us forward towards our near conclusion is, to what extent do you believe that we as Israel have had to employ an appeasement policy for the sake of nations that maybe they were enemies once, or they were undecided, because we're living at a time also where we have a huge world of undecideds. They don't know what to believe about Israel.
Okay.
Human rights violations, war crime, accusations of this lie and that, and now with the new government, more and more exaggerations and fear-mongering happening. Appeasement continues to play a role in many governmental decisions. Did it play a role for Israel? And did it play a role in any of the other countries for whom they were voting at the United Nations, or their behavior in the first decade of Israel's existence?
When you look at political science, you see that the most important thing, after all, is interests. If moral and interests combine, that's great. But the most important thing is interests. If we look back, 1923, Jabotinsky wrote an article in Russian called The Iron Wall. Ben-Gurion, who was a rival of Jabotinsky, adopted the Iron Wall. The Iron Wall says the time or when we're going to be strong, when we're going to build or finish building an iron wall that protects us, and the other side will understand that they cannot break it, they cannot scratch it, they cannot take it apart, only then they will talk to us, only then we're going to have peace. When you look back, you see that that's exactly what happened. When the other side, the first one was Egypt, understood that by force they cannot take back their land. They cannot take it back. They need peace treaty with Israel because Israel is strong. If I cannot defeat it, let's join it. And since today, till today, we have the iron wall that protects us and bring other states to negotiate with us, to talk with us. Sometimes we have mutual enemies. It's not love, it's mutual enemies. Maybe it's respect, but there is something that binds things together. I think even Abraham Accords have something to do with the iron wall. If I cannot beat it, let's join it. And that's Israel today. And we can talk with everybody now.
But put it in the context further of such a contemporary issue today of Iran, because you spoke about common interests. One of the issues that brought the Abraham Accords together
Is the mutual enemy.
is the mutual enemy of the terrorist focus, threatening focus of the Islamic Republic
Israel
of Iran.
can help us. Israel is a friend, not necessarily an enemy. We can gain something out of that relationship. Maybe during that relationship, I will see you're normal, you're okay, you're not the enemy anymore. But the beginning is interests. Let me join you. I think I can gain something. I think I can benefit out of our relationship. I think it will go further on. But the beginning is mutual enemy and the Iron Wall.
Well, it's fascinating that we are talking about 75 years of history and yet about modern realities at the exact same time. And I think that there's something very crucial to reminding all of our viewers about that value, that we can't just look at what's happening in the immediacy of our right now. We have to think in terms of the bigger spectrum of historical importance. What will be remembered about this century of Jewish sovereignty in our ancestral homeland? How long will it exist? Well, we have to reach somewhere between the 80 years of King David and the 380 years of the last Jewish sovereignty. So we've got our work cut out for us. But I think that we've uncovered a few of the elements that are crucial. Not only do you need diplomatic relations and that need for interpersonal relationships being established, but you also need, in the word iron wall, of course, being so charged just through its terminology, but it is a security fence, if you will. It is a Jewish pride, an unwillingness to bend toward the interests of others, because we recognize that the Jewish interest is also deserving. And not only deserving for moral or biblical reasons, but for logical and rational and moral reasons for all of humanity to gain from. Why is the Abraham Accords also so fascinating? Because whatever reason they decide to use us at its onset, in the aftermath, we have Holocaust education starting in Dubai. We have tremendous relationships being established through some of the biggest organizations, including the March of the Living and others who are really doing their strongest effort to change the way Jews are understood. As a historian and an expert of foreign defense policy, does the Jewish story matter? What would, as your historian's proclamation, we're honoring these international recognitions of our legal rights, what is yours?
The Jewish story matters, for sure. We are different from any other nation. No other nation have to take into consideration, when they decide upon their foreign policy, about the diaspora. I don't think that the Italians think about the Italians in America or in Russia. The Jewish state Israel must take into consideration the diaspora, the Jews everywhere. We are responsible for the Jews all over the world, the state of Israel. We are responsible for them. We always take it into consideration. Israel arevim ze lazeh. That's a phrase in Hebrew that, Israel should vouch for each other. Israel arevim ze lazeh. This is something unique. So the Jewish story, it's always in part of our DNA.
And it's important to always remind people, in a world that is very polarized, politicized, facing the heights of extremism and a lot of anti-Jewish hatred, we can call it whatever you want, Judeophobia, Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. I can give the list of the names, but at the end of the day, what we need to know is that fact of Jewish story, Jewish history, Jewish identity matters. Perhaps that will carry us on through additional decades into the future.
There was a comment about the diaspora, and we really focused almost exclusively on the Jewish diaspora in the United States. But we have to remember that there are Jewish communities throughout the world. There remains today a big Jewish community in Russia. Even following the fall of the Soviet Union, and emigration of Russian Jews from Russia to Israel, but also to the United States, to Canada, to elsewhere. After the Shoah, you had Jewish dispersion of survivors and their families to all parts of the world. During the Holocaust, you had Jews fleeing and they went to all parts of the world. So today you find in communities around the world, vibrant Jewish communities. I think that if you went to most of those communities and said, what is in your core? What is in your kishkas? What is in your heart? What's the center point? Almost all of them today would say Eretz Yisrael, the state of Israel. And when we talk about diaspora affairs, let's look at it beyond the United States as well in the diplomatic sphere. Because you asked before about Jewish organizations. Let's take a Jewish organization such as the World Jewish Congress, which represents Jewish communities from all over the world, bringing them together, the leadership of those communities, and then not just in the United States, but around the world also with the other organizations, some that I've mentioned, some that I haven't, but seeing to it that relations and standing with governments, whoever is the sitting government in countries around the world, will be treated with respect and will be asked to give respect to Israel. So when the United Nations convenes, many Jewish organizations work together to sit with the ambassadors, to sit with the prime ministers and the presidents who come to address the United Nations and use that opportunity to share thoughts and ideas. And by the way, they hear from different Jewish organizations, but also different Jewish views from right, center, and left, all of us working together in a rarely seen spirit of Jewish unity to do what you and Gadi have been talking about. And that is to address the issue of, does the Jewish story matter? To address the issue of the ancestral rights of the Jewish people here in this land. You know, when other peoples return to their lands, or they recognize a religious symbol or a building or an antiquity, the world applauds. Israel is created here in our ancestral homeland. And it's not a new creation. It's merely a rebirth. And that rebirth came about not just by snap of fingers and not just by a few people. It came about through decades of commitment of people to express the views that then led to the United Nations convening, adopting the Partition Resolution, enabling the creation of the independent Jewish state called the State of Israel, which we celebrate here today as we approach 75 years, a time period that is worth looking at. And I know in this forum, you plan in the Israel Forever Forum 75 to take a look at each decade. And today, although our concentration has been building up to 47 and looking at the decade, the fact of the matter is, like with all of Jewish history, we can't just look at one word or one period. I want to, for me, end with a short comment that I'd like to share with you. Simchat Torah, the end of the reading of the Torah, I had the privilege of being called up. And I looked there at the Torah scroll as I leaned over next to the Rabbi Gazinski in Bethesda. And I leaned over. And the last two words of the Torah are Kol Yisrael, all Israel. That doesn't just mean those in Israel. It doesn't just mean those in the United States. It means the Jewish people around the world. We are indeed one. It's not just a cliche. We are one. And then, by the way, immediately after reading Kol Yisrael, we go to the beginning of the next Torah. There isn't a minute that is wasted. And we begin with Bereshit, Genesis, where we all began. Thank you, Ilana, for hosting us.
I think that this has been a great way to take a historical era that I would say most people probably just chalk up to its most, the highlight moments. Okay, the celebration of November 29th and the celebration of the independence, and we have dissected it in a way that maybe gives information to our viewers that they can employ in their own understanding, because that has to be the ultimate goal. For us to be able to analyze some of the patterns of behavior, decision-making, what it takes to be a leader, whether in the Jewish world or for the whole world as a whole, to be able to advance interests. We also have to remember that fighting for Jewish interests is something that has been in our reality for thousands of years. Fighting for Jewish nationalistic interests, for the establishment, re-establishment of sovereignty in our ancestral homeland, it did not begin with Balfour, and it did not begin even with Herzl. But they do become fulfilled time and again, San Remo and others that have affirmed again and again that this land, the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, renamed Palestine, needs to always be bound to its origin. Why did Jerusalem, where we sit today, become important? However, different people and politicians and propagandists might twist around the history, what we know is that if we know our historical facts and the patterns of professional behaviors that needed to take place in order to make miracles happen, perhaps we ourselves fighting the fight of today can also make miracles happen. Perhaps there is something that every mother or grandmother, grandfather or father, uncle, cousin, friend, colleague, youth movement member, soccer team player, whomever you are, maybe you have learned something that you can share onward. Because the only reason that the Jewish story will continue to matter is if there are voices out there, not only historians, not only leaders and diplomats, but those of us who are armchair diplomats on social media, those of us who are meeting with our colleagues in offices, in our communities, in our synagogues, or those of us who don't belong, and maybe we're at the park and we read something in the news and we don't know what to think. We don't know what to say. Well, we at Israel Forever continue to provide endless resources and opportunities for you to expand your personal learning, for you to find your voice for personal activism. Following in the footsteps of great leaders before us, we come together as descendants of great leaders who have been voices for Jewish rights in the Jewish world. And we come with knowledge, and we come with passion, we come with the facts. Most people don't have all of this. They don't have the experience and the stories of meeting with the next president that we will discuss in our next installment of Forum 75, where we'll talk about civil rights movements and under President Johnson, who makes other changes in the attitude towards Israel. There are more topics to be explored than can be explored in our short time together. So we invite you to join us again and again for our Israel Forever programming, where we hope that you will continue to be inspired, enlightened, and empowered so that all together we can continue to raise our voice. We are all Israel, and it is up to all of us to make a difference, not only for today, not only for tomorrow, but forever. Thank you so much for joining us today.